If you ever want to understand how a human being transforms into a living nightmare, you have to look at the blood spilled in the winter of 1431. I found an old, yellowed chronicle buried deep in an archive, and the first line gave me absolute chills. It said the snow did not melt around the fortress of Sigasora that year. It just turned red. That was the exact moment Vlad the Impaler came into this world, born right into the Order of the Dragon under Vlad II Dragonal. People love to say monsters are born in the dark, but that is a lie. Monsters are carefully built, piece by agonizing piece, by the world around them. You can almost hear the newborn crying inside those freezing stone walls while wood smoke and the sharp smell of iron fill the air. Outside, the Ottoman army was already crawling across the horizon like an inescapable disease.
Before we dive into today's investigation, I want to be clear. The stories and theories shared on this channel are part of an alternative history exploration. We're digging into the unexplained, the unsettling, and the what-ifs of our world. Think of this as a journey into the dark side of history, part research, part legend. Watch with an open mind, but remember, this is for narrative and entertainment purposes only.
The baby had no idea his life was never going to belong to him. He was not a prince to his father. He was currency. A bargaining chip meant to be handed over to the executioner's block the moment political tides shifted. When you look closely at the earliest records of his life, you realize the terror did not start when he took the throne. It started in that cradle, where the shadow of absolute violence fell over him before he could even open his eyes. By 1442, 11-year-old Vlad and his little brother Radu were dragged straight into the Ottoman court of Sultan Murad II. They were not brought there as royal guests with velvet cushions and rich feasts. They were human collateral, held at knife point to force their father to stay in line. I was reading a translated transcript from a diplomat who watched the boys arrive in Edirne. He wrote that young Vlad never cried, not even once, while the guards dragged him through the grand gates. Instead, the boy just stared. He watched the Sultan's guards flay men alive in the central courtyard for simple acts of disobedience. He stood in the shadows, listening to the skin peeling away and memorizing every single scream. Most children would break permanently under that kind of trauma, but Vlad was doing math. He saw how an empire of millions was held together by pure, unadulterated fear. He realized right then that honor is a myth sold to weak men. If you want absolute control over human beings, you do not ask for their love. You break their spirits so completely that they forget how to fight back. That royal court was not a palace to Vlad. It was an academy of slaughter, and he was becoming its top student. They threw Vlad into the deepest cell beneath the palace of Edirne in 1444 because he refused to bow his head and smile for the Sultan. Think about being 14 years old, locked in pitch-black stone where you cannot even see your own hand in front of your face. There is a secret diary entry from an Ottoman guard that survived the centuries. He wrote that the subterranean dungeons smelled like mold, rotting flesh, and damp earth. Day after day, month after month, Vlad sat in that silence, listening to water dripping from the ceiling and the faint, dying rattles of forgotten prisoners in adjacent cells. That dark room is where Vlad's human heart completely rotted away. Every shred of empathy, warmth, or mercy was systematically burned out of his nervous system. When the heavy iron door finally creaked open and they dragged him back into the sunlight, the terrified, stubborn child was dead. Standing in his place was a cold, calculating force of nature. He had figured out the ultimate secret of human psychology while sitting in that filth. Pain is temporary, but psychological dread can paralyze an entire kingdom before a sword is even drawn. He was ready to test that theory on the world. In 1447, the worst news possible reached Vlad while he was still stranded in exile. The corrupt boyars, the wealthy nobles back home in Wallachia who swore solemn oaths to protect his family, turned into ruthless snakes for a few bags of silver. They ambushed his father and murdered him in the mud. But what they did to his older brother Mircea was infinitely worse. They dragged Mircea out into the forest, gouged his eyes out with red-hot pokers, and buried him alive in a shallow grave while he was still breathing. I came across an old letter describing Vlad's reaction when he received the report. He did not scream, and he did not shed a single tear. Blood literally rushed out of his face, leaving him looking like a corpse, and a wave of pure ice took over his veins. The men who shared his bloodline had been butchered by the very people they trusted to rule. That was the exact moment Vlad abandoned all traditional rules of morality. He saw that loyalty was a fragile lie used by weak people right up until they stab you in the back. His eventual return to Wallachia was never going to be about political governance or bringing peace. It was going to be an absolute, systematic extermination of everyone who had crossed his lineage. Supported by a wave of Ottoman cavalry who thought they could use him as a puppet, 17-year-old Vlad marched into Targovist in 1448 and seized the throne. I was examining a map of the royal court from that exact period. The grand hall was filled with the very boyars who had ordered his brother buried alive. They stood there, sweating through their expensive fur coats, trying to offer fake smiles and fake pledges of loyalty to a teenager. Vlad sat on that cold throne and stared at them with eyes that looked completely dead. He knew they were plotting against him from the second he sat down. Sure enough, just 2 short months later, rival Prince Vladislav II swept in with a massive force and chased Vlad right back into the frozen mountains. As he fled through the dense forest, bleeding and hunted, Vlad stopped his horse and looked back at the city lights. He made a quiet, terrifying vow to the night air. He swore that when he came back, and he knew he would come back, he would ensure that no human being in Wallachia would ever have the strength or courage to betray him again. Fast forward to 1456, and the night sky over Europe looks like it is literally tearing apart. Halley's Comet was blazing across the dark heavens, casting an eerie, unnatural glow over the landscape. Medieval peasants were screaming in the streets, falling to their knees, convinced the world was coming to an apocalyptic end. Vlad saw that terrifying light in the sky not as a curse, but as an invitation. He tracked down his rival Vladislav II, confronted him in brutal hand-to-hand combat, and personally slaughtered him in the dirt. Reclaiming his birthright, Vlad walked right back into the Grand Hall of Targovist as the comet burned above. An observer wrote in a recovered manuscript that when Vlad put the crown back on his head, the entire room went dead silent. Nobody dared to breathe. The peasants whispered in hushed, terrified tones that the cosmos itself had unleashed a literal devil upon the earth to rule them. They had no idea that their worst nightmares were not even close to what Vlad had planned for the kingdom. The real horror was just getting started, and it would leave an indelible scar on human history. Easter Sunday of 1457 was supposed to be a day of peace and religious celebration. Vlad sent out formal invitations to every single corrupt boyar family in the land, claiming he wanted to put the past behind them and host a grand feast of reconciliation. The nobles fell for it completely. They dressed in their absolute finest velvet robes, dripping in jewels, and walked right into the grand palace hall alongside their wives and children. Wine poured like water, roasted meat was piled high on wooden platters, and nervous laughter echoed off the high stone walls. Vlad sat at the head of the long table, quietly watching them eat and drink for hours without touching a single bite himself. Then, right as the feast concluded, Vlad stood up, and his cold smile instantly vanished. Without saying a word, he signaled his guards. Heavy oak doors slammed shut all around the perimeter, and massive iron bars dropped into place with a sickening thud. The room erupted into immediate panic. Vlad stepped down from the dais, looked at the trembling families, and delivered a terrifying decree that made their blood run cold. The feast was over, but his revenge was going to last forever. Vlad did not just kill the people who betrayed his family. He turned their deaths into a terrifying display of absolute authority. Right outside the palace walls, he separated the elderly nobles who were too weak to work. He had long wooden stakes sharpened right in front of their eyes and impaled them on the spot, leaving their bodies to rot in the open air. But for the younger boyars and their delicate wives, he reserved a far more brutal psychological torture. Still wearing their mud-stained, ruined silk dresses and velvet coats, they were forced at knife point to march 50 agonizing miles through treacherous, jagged mountain passes. Their destination was the crumbling ruins of Castle Poenary. Perched high on a cliff, Vlad's guards threw rusted iron hammers and picks at their feet. He forced these wealthy aristocrats to construct his mountain fortress by hand. They hauled massive stones up vertical cliffs until their expensive clothes rotted off their backs and their bare fingers bled directly into the stone mortar. Most of them collapsed from total exhaustion and died right there on the mountainside. Their bodies left where they fell while the survivors kept digging. By 1458, a haunting transformation was taking place along every major trade route leading into Wallachia. Travelers coming around mountain bends were greeted by a sight so horrific it made experienced soldiers turn around and run. Miles of long, perfectly aligned rows of thick wooden stakes stretched out as far as the eye could see. Every stake was stripped clean of its bark and heavily oiled. You see, Vlad had turned execution into an exact, gruesome science. He explicitly instructed his executioners never to use sharp points on the wood. Instead, the tops were carefully rounded off. When the stake was driven into the victim's body, it would slowly force its way through tissue without rupturing vital organs. This kept the victim alive, suspended off the ground, writhing in unimaginable agony under the scorching sun for 3 or 4 days straight before death finally showed mercy. I was reading a letter written by a terrified foreign trader who passed through the area. He said Vlad did not view this as senseless cruelty at all. To Vlad, this was pure mathematical order, a physical, undeniable map of total consequence for anyone who dared to break his laws. The Saxon merchants from the rich border town of Brasov made the fatal mistake of thinking they were above Vlad's absolute economic rules in 1459. They ignored his strict trade laws, believing a young prince would never dare mess with powerful international businessmen. They calculated wrong. Vlad rode into their town in broad daylight with a company of cavalry, surrounding the market square before anyone could react. He rounded up thousands of merchants, women, and children, dragging them out into a broad green field overlooking the town. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, thousands of stakes were driven into the dirt, while men and women screamed in agony around him. Dying slowly on the wood, Vlad had a grand dining table set up right in the middle of the horror. He sat down, calmly cut his food, and enjoyed a rich meal while surrounded by a writhing ocean of blood and agony. An old text notes that one of Vlad's personal servants gagged and complained about the overwhelming stench of raw blood filling the afternoon air. Vlad paused, looked at the servant, and calmly ordered his guards to impale the man on a stake twice as high as the others, so he could sit above the field and breathe much cleaner air. I found a transcript of a letter written by a foreign ambassador in 1459 that sounds completely impossible, but every single historical source confirms it. Right in the middle of Targovist's main square, beside the public drinking fountain, Vlad placed a cup made of solid, heavy gold. Think about that for a second. This was a land overrun by extreme poverty, starvation, and desperate thieves. Yet, that gold cup sat out in the open, completely unguarded, day and night. Anyone could use it to drink water, but nobody ever dared to move it an inch from that fountain. A person could walk by in the pitch black of midnight, stare directly at a fortune that could feed their family for generations, and walk away without touching it. Crime did not just drop. It was completely erased from the kingdom overnight. But it was not because the people suddenly became righteous or pious. It was because Vlad had planted a permanent, paralyzing terror inside every single human brain. Everyone knew that even thinking about stealing that cup meant a wooden stake driven slowly through your chest while your family watched. In the winter of 1460, Vlad decided to solve the problem of poverty and sickness in Wallachia using the most cold-blooded logic imaginable. He sent word across the entire country, inviting all the beggars, the sick, the crippled, and the homeless to a grand feast at a massive hall in the capital. He promised them endless food, warm fire, and a permanent relief from their daily suffering. Hundreds of desperate, starving people dragged themselves through the freezing mud, thinking their prince had finally shown a spark of human mercy. They sat at long wooden tables, gorging on roasted meats, fresh bread, and heavy wine, laughing and crying with joy. Vlad walked among them, asking if they wished to be freed from their misery forever, and the crowd cheered in gratitude. Vlad quietly turned around, walked out the front exit, and signaled his personal guards. Heavy wooden beams were slammed across every door and window from the outside, locking hundreds of souls in the dark. Before anyone realized what was happening, Vlad's men tossed blazing torches onto the dry, thatched roof. The entire hall erupted into a wall of fire, consuming every single voice inside as Vlad stood in the snow, watching the flames lick the sky. The year 1461 brought high-ranking Ottoman envoys sent directly by Sultan Mehmed II, the terrifying conqueror who had just smashed the legendary walls of Constantinople. They marched into Vlad's court with absolute arrogance, demanding hundreds of young Wallachian boys to be trained as elite slave soldiers, along with a massive cash tribute. Vlad sat on his throne, listening silently as the diplomats spoke to him without ever taking off their traditional silk turbans. When Vlad calmly asked them why they refused to uncover their heads in the presence of a ruling monarch, the envoy scoffed, stating it was their ancient religious custom. Vlad leaned forward, a dark, terrifying grin breaking across his face. He said he respected their devotion so much that he wanted to make sure their customs were preserved permanently. On his command, guards tackled the envoys to the stone floor. Blacksmiths stepped out from the shadows carrying iron spikes and heavy wooden mallets. As the diplomats shrieked in horror, Vlad ordered the guards to drive iron nails straight through the cloth and deep into the men's skulls, fixing their turbans to their heads forever before sending their bloody bodies back to Constantinople. Knowing that Mehmed II would unleash the full, terrifying weight of the Ottoman army after such an insult, Vlad decided to strike first. In the middle of a brutal, freezing winter night in late 1461, Vlad led a small shadow force across the frozen, ice-choked Danube River. He and his men wore captured Ottoman armor and spoke fluent Turkish, allowing them to slip right past border outposts completely unnoticed. What followed was pure, uninterrupted slaughter. Moving like ghosts through the snow, Vlad's men moved from camp to camp, slicing the throats of thousands of sleeping Ottoman soldiers and local collaborators. Over 23,000 people were butchered in less than 48 hours. But Vlad did not just want a military victory. He wanted psychological dominance. He ordered his commanders to collect the severed ears and noses of every single victim. Days later, Christian rulers across Europe received heavy canvas bags delivered directly to their courts. When they dumped the contents onto their grand tables, hundreds of frozen human ears rolled out, accompanied by a letter from Vlad stating that this was merely the down payment of his war. Sultan Mehmed II was furious beyond words, and he immediately dispatched his top military strategist, the ruthless commander Hamza Pasha, to crush Vlad once and for all. Hamza Pasha set a clever ambush in a tight mountain gorge near the fortress of Giurgiu, planning to trap Vlad's smaller force in a deadly bottleneck. But Vlad was always 3 steps ahead of his enemies. Through a network of terrified informants, Vlad mapped out the exact coordinates of the Ottoman trap before his horses even left the stable. Instead of marching into the gorge, Vlad's cavalry silently encircled the surrounding ridges under the cover of a dense mountain fog. When Hamza Pasha gave the signal to strike, he realized with sickening horror that no one was in the valley below. Suddenly, the blare of war horns echoed from the cliffs above, and Vlad's men poured down from all sides like a tidal wave. The entire Ottoman force was systematically wiped out without firing a single effective shot. When the battle ended, Vlad personally oversaw the fate of the survivors. A towering, massive wooden stake was erected right in the middle of the gorge, and Hamza Pasha was impaled upon its apex, forced to die looking down at thousands of his own men rotting on smaller stakes below him. By the summer of 1462, Sultan Mehmed II realized that Vlad was a threat unlike anything the empire had ever faced, and he decided to end it personally. He assembled a massive armada of over 100,000 elite Ottoman troops, including his legendary janissaries, and marched straight toward Wallachia. Vlad looked at the military intelligence reports and knew that facing an army of that size on an open battlefield was guaranteed suicide. His force of roughly 30,000 men would be crushed in hours. So Vlad unleashed a scorched earth strategy so absolute it horrified his own commanders. As the Ottoman army crossed the border, they found no cities to conquer and no soldiers to fight. Vlad ordered his own people to burn every single farm, chop down every fruit tree, and destroy every village in the invaders' path. Dead livestock and dead human bodies were thrown directly into every well and river, poisoning the water supply. The massive Ottoman war machine marched into a haunting, silent wasteland where there was not a single scrap of food to eat or a single drop of clean water to drink. As the starving Ottoman troops marched deeper into Wallachia under a punishing summer heat, Vlad introduced a form of biological warfare never before seen in human history. He scoured his land for people suffering from the most horrific, contagious diseases of the era: bubonic plague, leprosy, and smallpox. He paid these dying, desperate souls handsomely, dressed them in traditional Ottoman turbans and robes, and instructed them to slip into the enemy camps at night. They wandered freely among the weary Ottoman soldiers, sharing their blankets, eating from their food pots, and coughing in their tents. Within days, an invisible horror ripped through the Sultan's ranks. Men began waking up with black, oozing buboes in their armpits, coughing up blood, and collapsing into violent fevers. Paranoia completely shattered the army's morale. Foreign chronicles note that Ottoman soldiers began muttering prayers in their tents at night, whispering that the land itself was cursed by a demon that killed without ever swinging a sword. On the night of June 17, 1462, Vlad executed one of the most audacious and terrifying military strikes in ancient history, known as the Night Attack of Targovist. Under a moonless sky, Vlad personally led 24,000 screaming horsemen right into the center of the sprawling Ottoman war camp. Vlad and his vanguard were dressed in captured Ottoman uniforms, allowing them to breach the outer perimeter guards before anyone realized what was happening. Once inside, total hell broke loose. Vlad's men set fire to hundreds of silk supply tents, creating a blinding inferno while slicing through sleeping soldiers. Panic spread like wildfire through the pitch-black camp. Because Vlad's men were dressed as Ottoman troops, terrified soldiers drew their scimitars and began hacking down their own comrades in the dark, unable to tell friend from foe. Vlad's sole objective that night was not to defeat the army, but to cut off its head. He carved a bloody path straight toward the Grand Royal Pavilion, slaughtering everyone in his way, driven by a singular obsession to plunge his sword through the Sultan's heart. Swords clashed violently in the flickering darkness as Vlad kicked open the grand, silk flaps of the royal tent, his blade dripping with fresh blood. He lunged inside to execute the Sultan, only to find the pavilion completely empty. In the utter chaos of the night, Mem too had been rushed away by his fiercely loyal Janissary guards and hidden deep within a heavily fortified ring of shields at the rear of the camp. Realizing his target was gone and that the first light of dawn was about to break, exposing his tiny force to the true size of the Ottoman army, Vlad did not panic. He blew his horn, rallied his cavalry, and ordered a swift, organized retreat into the dark, jagged mountain passes. Behind him, the Ottoman camp was a smoldering mass of ash and corpses. Thousands of the Sultan's elite soldiers lay dead, killed mostly by their own terrified comrades in the dark. The night attack had failed to kill the Sultan, but it had achieved something far more lethal. It completely broke the psychological sanity of the invading force. As the sun rose over the smoldering ruins of his camp, a thoroughly shaken Sultan Mehmed II regrouped his surviving men. Enraged and desperate to prove his military dominance, he ordered a relentless, fast-paced march directly toward Vlad's capital city of Targovist. The remaining troops marched for days, hollow-eyed, starving, and sick from disease, driven forward only by the promise of finally taking the capital. As they drew within a few miles of the city, a thick, unnatural mountain fog rolled over the dirt road, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The air suddenly grew thick, cold, and violently rancid. A sickening stench of rotting meat hit the soldiers so hard that men began gagging and covering their faces with torn cloth. Sultan Mehmed rode at the very front of the column with his sword drawn, his eyes darting frantically into the mist, expecting an immediate ambush behind every tree. But as the thick fog slowly began to part in the morning sun, the conqueror of Constantinople came face to face with a sight so unimaginable that it would haunt his mind until the day he died. I saw a leaked diary translation from an Ottoman soldier who survived that valley, and his opening line made my stomach turn completely inside out. He wrote that the sun did not bring light to Targovist that morning. It just made the flies visible. As the morning fog lifted, the entire 100,000-man Ottoman army froze dead in their tracks. Spanning 3 full kilometers long and a kilometer wide was a literal man-made forest of death. Over 20,000 human beings, men, women, children, and infants, were impaled on massive wooden poles rotting in the open air. The ground beneath them was a thick, black swamp of dried blood and human decay. Thousands of ravens swarmed the air, so loud that their wings sounded like thunder, tearing flesh off bodies that had been baking in the scorching sun for months. You could see infants impaled on the same stakes as their mothers, their tiny arms hanging limp in the wind. It was not a battleground. It was an absolute nightmare brought into physical reality. Vlad did not build this grid to defend a castle or hold a line. He built it as a geometric map of total horror, designed specifically to breach the human mind. The soldiers standing at the front of the line could not even look away. The stench was so violently suffocating that men were dropping their weapons, sinking into the dirt, and throwing up blood. Every single path through the valley was lined with these wooden stakes, forcing the army to walk directly between rows of rotting faces staring down at them with hollow eyes. Sultan Mehmed II was a man who had stared into the heart of brutal sieges, torn down ancient stone walls, and conquered Constantinople without flinching. But as he stood in front of that rotting forest, his mind completely shattered. I was reading a confidential report sent back to the Hungarian court describing the Sultan's reaction. He did not issue a single command. He just stood paralyzed on his horse, his eyes wide with utter disbelief, staring at the thousands of corpses swaying gently in the breeze. Right beside him, his most battle-hardened veteran generals dropped to their knees in the dirt, throwing up uncontrollably and weeping like children. These were elite commanders who had spent their entire lives slaughtering enemies on open battlefields, but they had never seen human life treated like endless, disposable meat on display. Mehmed realized in that horrifying second that he was not fighting a human military leader who cared about territory, treaties, or survival. He was fighting a living, walking force of nature that operated on pure psychological destruction. You cannot bargain with a man who views mass execution as art. You cannot intimidate a leader who turns his own country into a slaughterhouse just to break your spirit. The conqueror of empires was completely defeated, not by swords or arrows, but by an absolute, paralyzing psychological terror that stripped away his will to fight. Without a single arrow being shot from the city walls, the grandest and most powerful army on earth turned around and ran. Sultan Mehmed II gave the official order to fall back, abandoning his entire campaign to conquer Wallachia. Think about the absolute scale of that victory. A tiny principality with a fraction of the soldiers and resources had just forced the Ottoman Empire into a full, humiliating retreat purely through mental warfare. I came across an old chronicle detailing the march back to the Danube River. The Ottoman soldiers marched in total silence, constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified that the trees themselves were going to spring to life and impale them in the night. They left behind supply wagons, weapons, and armor just to move faster away from that cursed valley. High up in the jagged rocks of the Carpathian Mountains, Vlad stood on the battlements of his stone fortress, watching the massive army march away into the distance. He had proved his point to the entire world. Fear was stronger than armies, stronger than gold, and stronger than empires. But while Vlad had won the ultimate mental war against the Sultan, the real snake was already creeping into his house from behind, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the Sultan realized he could never break Vlad with steel, he deployed a far more dangerous weapon, Vlad's own flesh and blood. He sent Radu the Handsome, Vlad's younger brother who had grown up alongside him in the Ottoman court. But Radu was the exact opposite of Vlad. He was charming, handsome, polished, and backed by endless chests of Ottoman gold. Radu did not march in with screaming cavalry or bloody stakes. He slipped into Wallachia quietly, visiting the surviving boyars in secret and offering them a way out. I was looking at a translated ledger of bribes paid during that summer, and it is shocking how cheap loyalty really was. Radu promised the exhausted nobles that if they backed him, the terrifying executions would stop immediately. Trade would return, the Ottoman army would leave them in peace, and they could keep their wealth without living every second in fear of the stake. The boyars were completely broken and tired of living under a tyrant who expected absolute perfection. One by one, Vlad's top generals and inner circle quietly turned their backs on him, trading their terrifying demon prince for a comfortable puppet ruler. Vlad suddenly found himself completely isolated, surrounded by men who were just waiting for the right moment to hand his head over for silver. By late 1462, Radu's army surrounded Vlad's ultimate mountain stronghold, Castle Poenary, perched high on a jagged cliff overlooking the Argesh River. Heavy Ottoman cannons brought up the mountain trails slammed into the ancient stone towers day and night, shattering walls that had stood for generations. Inside the crumbling castle, Vlad and his young wife were trapped like animals in a cage. I read a heartbreaking local legend recorded in the surrounding villages shortly after the siege. Vlad's wife knew what the enemy troops would do to her if the castle fell. She knew the brutal torture and public humiliation that awaited her. Looking out over the shattered wall at the river spinning far below, she whispered that she would rather let her body be eaten by the fish of the Argesh than end up in an Ottoman dungeon. She stepped off the edge of the high tower, falling hundreds of feet into the icy waters below. With his fortress crumbling to dust and his wife dead in the river, Vlad did not surrender. He crawled through a narrow, secret tunnel carved deep into the mountain rock, slipping past the enemy lines under the cover of a freezing night, hunted like a wild beast in his own land. Vlad fled into Transylvania expecting his Christian ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, to give him fresh troops to take back his throne. Instead, the Hungarian king betrayed him immediately, throwing the Impaler into a pitch-black cell beneath the fortress of Visegrad. For 12 long years, from 1462 to 1474, the most feared man in Europe sat in isolation, completely stripped of his crown, his army, and his freedom. But you cannot turn off a mind built for psychological horror. I found a chilling report written by a prison guard who watched Vlad through a small iron grate in the door. He wrote that Vlad never lost his terrifying obsession with absolute order and punishment. Sitting in the dark filth of his cell, Vlad would catch mice, rats, and stray birds that flew near his window. He would whittle small wooden sticks with his fingernails and meticulously impale the tiny animals, arranging them in neat, perfect lines on the floor of his cell. Even locked in a hole beneath the earth, deprived of human subjects, the real-life Thanos was still enforcing his gruesome, mathematical order on anything that dared to cross his path. While Vlad was locked away in that dungeon, King Matthias launched a massive propaganda campaign to make sure the Impaler never gained public sympathy again. The newly invented printing press was sweeping across Western Europe, and the king used it to publish detailed woodcut pamphlets about Vlad's horrific life. These pamphlets were filled with graphic illustrations showing Vlad eating dinner among forests of impaled bodies, dipping his bread in human blood, and burning women and children alive. I was examining one of the surviving original woodcuts from 1470, and the imagery is terrifyingly vivid. It became the very first viral media sensation in European history. People in Germany, France, and England read these printed flyers with wide-eyed terror, turning Vlad into a mythical, bloodthirsty demon in the public imagination. But when news of these stories reached Vlad in his cell, he did not care. In fact, he secretly loved it. He knew that kings and kingdoms crumble into dust, but a reputation built on pure, unadulterated terror would outlive every single man who tried to destroy him. By 1475, the geopolitical chessboard shifted once again, and Western Europe found itself in absolute panic. Ottoman forces were pushing hard into the Balkans, smashing through Christian defenses, and King Matthias realized he had made a massive mistake locking up his most terrifying weapon. He needed a demon to fight demons. The Hungarian king opened the cell door and released Vlad, placing him back at the head of an army to secure the southern border. At 45 years old, Vlad was gray-haired, heavily scarred, and hollow-eyed, but his inner fire of vengeance was burning hotter than ever. In late 1476, Vlad marched back into Wallachia for the third time, cutting down any opposition in his way and reclaiming his throne. I found a letter from a terrified noble who witnessed Vlad's return to Targovist. He wrote that when Vlad stepped back into the central square, the entire city fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The boyars trembled in their boots, terrified that the monster had literally risen from the grave to finish the purge he had started decades ago. In December 1476, just weeks after taking back his kingdom, the dark journey finally came to a violent, bloody end. While riding through a heavy snowstorm near Bucharest with a small vanguard of loyal men, Vlad was ambushed by a massive force of Ottoman soldiers and loyalists fighting for a rival prince. The freezing forest erupted into absolute chaos as swords clashed under the snow-covered trees. Vlad fought like a possessed demon, screaming and slicing through wave after wave of attackers in the deep drifts. An old local account suggests his own men may have mistaken him for the enemy in the blinding snow and chaos, stabbing him in the back. When the dust settled, the man who had crushed 40,000 souls lay lifeless in the freezing mud. His enemies swarmed his fallen body, hacking it to pieces with axes, tearing off his armor, and leaving his dismembered limbs scattered in the red-stained snow for the wolves to finish. to prove to the entire world that the devil was truly dead and would never rise again. Vlad's severed head was carefully retrieved from the battlefield. His face was preserved in a jar of sweet honey, packed inside a padded silk box, and sent on a fast horse straight to Constantinople. When Sultan Mehmed II opened the box and saw the cold, lifeless eyes of the man who had haunted his dreams for decades, he gave a final, terrifying order. The head of Vlad the Impaler was carried into the central public square of Constantinople and driven directly onto the tip of a massive wooden stake, high above the crowd for everyone to see. The real-life Thanos had finally met his end, impaled by the very weapon he had perfected against his enemies. But as the cold winter wind blew through the streets of Europe, people realized that killing the man did not kill his memory. His cold, mathematical methodology of absolute terror had permanently burned itself into the DNA of human history, proving that long after bodies rot away, true psychological dread never dies.